Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
That is.
Until now.
For more than 130 years, Jack the Ripper has haunted history, his name etched in blood across the narrow alleys of Victorian London. In the autumn of 1888, Whitechapel became the center of one of the most infamous, unsolved murder cases ever recorded. 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, were brutally murdered, and several of their bodies were subjected to horrifying mutilation. The crimes were concentrated within a relatively small area of East London, creating the impression of a predator who understood the streets, chose his victims carefully, and disappeared into the same darkness from which he emerged. The brutality shocked Victorian society, but what made the case truly extraordinary was the disappearance of the killer himself. There was no arrest, no trial, no confession, and no definitive identification. The police investigation eventually faded, but the legend only grew stronger. Whitechapel was already a world of stark contrasts. Wealth and privilege existed only a short distance from overcrowded lodging houses. Poverty, disease, prostitution, and violent crime. At night, gas lamps illuminated narrow streets where thousands of people lived almost on top of one another, creating the perfect environment for a killer who understood how easily a person could vanish into a crowd. As the murders continued, newspapers transformed the crimes into a national obsession. The name Jack the Ripper emerged from letters allegedly written by the killer, although the authenticity of those letters remains heavily disputed. Police officers flooded the streets, witnesses were questioned, suspects were investigated, and theories spread through London almost as quickly as the rumors. Yet the killer remained beyond their reach. When Mary Jane Kelly was murdered in November 1888, her mutilated body was so horrifying that even experienced investigators were deeply disturbed. Then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the killing appeared to stop. No more canonical victims, no final arrest, just silence. And that silence created the legend that has survived for generations. But behind that legend was a name that would eventually return to the center of the investigation: Aaron Kosminski. Born in 1865 in Kładawa, Poland, Kosminski was a Jewish immigrant who eventually settled in London's East End and worked as a barber. To ordinary residents of Whitechapel, he may have appeared to be just another struggling immigrant trying to survive in one of London's poorest districts. Yet years after the murders, his name appeared in the records of Scotland Yard. In a 1894 memorandum, Assistant Chief Constable Sir Melville Macnaghten identified a suspect named Kosminski among 3 men considered significant in the investigation. Later, police accounts also referred to a Polish Jewish suspect who was believed to have displayed an intense hatred of women and violent tendencies. The problem was that suspicion was not evidence. Police never possessed the kind of forensic proof that could connect Kosminski directly to the murders, and he was never prosecuted for them. Kosminski's later life only added to the mystery. His mental health deteriorated, and he was eventually confined to psychiatric institutions, where records described severe delusions, hallucinations, and increasingly disturbed behavior. He died in 1919 after spending years institutionalized. For decades, however, his name remained only one possibility among many. Then, more than a century after the murders, something unexpected brought the theory back to life. A battered silk and wool shawl said to have been connected to the murder of Catherine Eddowes. The story of the shawl is where the modern controversy truly begins. According to the account later promoted by its owner, the garment was supposedly recovered near Eddowes' body on September 30, 1888, by Sergeant Amos Simpson, who intended to take it home as a gift for his wife. She reportedly rejected it, and the shawl was eventually preserved within the family before resurfacing many decades later. In 2007, the artifact was purchased at auction by author Russell Edwards, who believed that it could contain biological evidence from the night of Edows's murder. What had once been treated as an old and disturbing family relic suddenly became something potentially far more important: a possible time capsule from one of the most notorious crime scenes in history. Edwards turned to molecular biologist Dr. Jari Louhelainen, who examined the shawl using modern forensic techniques. Researchers reported finding stains that they believed were consistent with blood and other biological material. The investigation became particularly controversial when mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, was reportedly extracted from the fabric and compared with descendants connected to Aaron Kosminski's maternal family line. The results were presented as a remarkable discovery. According to Edwards and Louhelainen, the genetic material appeared to connect the shawl to both Catherine Eddowes and the Kosminski family. For supporters of the theory, the implications were enormous. After more than 120 years of speculation, they believed they had finally found a physical link between one of the victims and the man long suspected by Scotland Yard. The claim gained international attention, particularly after the findings were published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. By the late 2000s and into the 2020s, the shawl had become the centerpiece of the modern case for Kosminski. Edwards promoted the evidence through his book and numerous interviews, arguing that the combination of DNA, historical records, geography, and Kosminski's documented mental deterioration created a compelling case. By 2025, the story was being presented in some circles as a potential solution to one of history's greatest mysteries. After generations of uncertainty, there appeared to be something tangible, not merely a suspect's name in an old police memorandum, but biological material allegedly preserved on an object connected to one of the murders. Yet the same piece of evidence that appeared to bring the mystery closer to a solution also opened a completely new battlefield. Almost immediately, scientists and historians began questioning the shawl's provenance. There is no universally accepted police record establishing that this particular garment was recovered from the Eddowes crime scene. Its documented history begins much later, leaving a substantial gap between 1888 and its modern appearance. That gap matters enormously in forensic science. If researchers cannot establish where an object was, who handled it, and how it was preserved throughout its history, then even a genuine DNA match becomes difficult to interpret. The possibility of contamination becomes unavoidable, especially when an artifact has allegedly passed through private hands for generations. Then there is the DNA itself. Mitochondrial DNA is powerful for tracing maternal ancestry, but it does not provide the same individualizing power as a complete nuclear DNA profile. A mitochondrial match can show that two samples are compatible with the same maternal lineage, but it does not automatically prove that they came from the same individual. That distinction became central to the controversy surrounding the shawl. Supporters saw the genetic result as one piece of a much larger puzzle, arguing that it became significant when combined with Kosminski's historical connection to Whitechapel and his appearance in police records. Critics countered that the genetic evidence alone could not establish that Kosminski himself had been present at the crime scene, especially when the chain of custody of the shawl remained uncertain. And this is where the Jack the Ripper mystery entered its newest and most complicated phase. The shawl did not produce the simple answer many people expected. Instead, it created two competing narratives. In one, a forgotten artifact had survived for more than a century, and finally preserved a biological clue capable of identifying the killer. In the other, an artifact with an uncertain history was being asked to carry far more evidentiary weight than the surviving science could safely support. By 2025, the debate was no longer simply about who Jack the Ripper might have been. It had become a larger question about how historical evidence should be tested, how ancient DNA should be interpreted, and whether a compelling story can ever substitute for an unbroken chain of proof. The most intriguing part is that the shawl did not emerge from nowhere. It intersected with a suspect whose name had already appeared in the original investigation more than a century earlier. Kosminski had the geography, the historical suspicion, and the later institutional records. Now, supporters argued, there was potentially a biological connection as well. But whether that connection represents the long-awaited breakthrough or simply another chapter in a 130-year-old mystery remains fiercely contested. And that is what makes the modern Jack the Ripper case so fascinating. The new evidence did not simply revive an old theory. It transformed the entire debate. For the first time, modern forensic science appeared capable of reaching back across more than a century and touching the physical evidence of a Victorian murder. But science also brought something else with it: a demand for provenance, reproducibility, contamination controls, and evidence that can withstand independent scrutiny. The shawl may have brought Aaron Kosminski back into the spotlight, but it has not silenced the question that has haunted historians for generations. Did science finally identify Jack the Ripper, or did it simply create the most convincing theory yet? In 2007, the shawl resurfaced at auction and was purchased by author Russell Edwards. Where others saw a morbid relic, Edwards saw potential evidence. He believed the shawl could still hold forensic traces from the night of Eddowes' slaying, and he turned to Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a molecular biologist, for testing. Using modern tools, including ultraviolet light, microscopy, and spectrophotometry, Louhelainen identified blood traces that appeared consistent with Eddowes' medical history, including symptoms associated with Bright's disease, a kidney condition she was known to have. That alone seemed to suggest that the shawl might have been present at the crime scene. But the real shock came when researchers reported finding semen stains on the cloth. Louhelainen extracted mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, from the material and compared it with DNA from a living descendant of Aaron Kosminski's sister. According to Edwards and Louhelainen, the genetic profile matched. They argued that the shawl contained biological material from both the victim and the man they believed was her killer. And suddenly, Aaron Kosminski was no longer simply an old police suspect. He appeared to have a physical connection to an artifact allegedly linked to one of the Ripper murders. In 2019, the findings were published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, giving the theory an additional layer of credibility in the eyes of the public. By 2025, the story had reignited global interest. Edwards promoted his book, Jack the Ripper, The Definitive Case, gave interviews, and appeared on television programs such as Today Australia, where he presented the evidence as the solution to a mystery that had survived for more than a century. Headlines proclaimed, "Jack the Ripper identified," while social media filled with excitement, disbelief, and arguments over whether the world's most famous, unsolved murder had finally been solved. For true crime enthusiasts, it looked like the moment history had been waiting for. But beneath the headlines, scientists and historians were asking a much more uncomfortable question. How strong was the evidence really? The first major problem was the chain of custody. The shawl's history between the murder in 1888 and its appearance in the modern era is not documented well enough to establish with certainty that it was actually present at the Eddowes crime scene. According to the story surrounding the artifact, it was allegedly taken from the scene by a police officer and eventually passed through a private family. But there is no surviving police record that conclusively establishes the garment as crime scene evidence, and that creates a fundamental forensic problem. If an object cannot be securely traced from the moment it was recovered to the moment it was tested, how can researchers be certain that the biological material found on it came from the original crime, rather than from one of the many people who handled it over the following decades? Then came the question of mitochondrial DNA itself. This distinction is crucial because mtDNA does not identify an individual in the same way that a complete nuclear DNA profile can. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited through the maternal line, meaning that people who share the same maternal ancestry can possess the same or closely related mitochondrial profile. So even if the DNA recovered from the shawl is genuinely ancient and genuinely connected to the Eddowes crime, a match with a relative of Kosminski does not automatically prove that Kosminski himself handled the garment. It establishes compatibility with a maternal lineage. In a densely populated area such as Victorian East London, where thousands of people lived within a relatively small geographic area, that distinction becomes extremely important. And then there was the contamination problem. The shawl was not sealed inside a modern forensic evidence bag for more than a century. It reportedly passed through families, collectors, auctioneers, historians, researchers, and other individuals before reaching the laboratory. Every person who touched it potentially introduced new biological material. Every environment in which it was stored created another opportunity for contamination. Modern DNA analysis can detect extraordinarily tiny traces of genetic material, but that sensitivity is a double-edged sword. It can help scientists recover biological evidence from ancient objects, but it can also detect DNA that arrived long after the original event. When researchers are trying to distinguish between DNA deposited in 1888 and DNA introduced decades later, the object's history becomes just as important as the genetic sequence itself. The controversy became even more serious when questions were raised about the underlying data and the ability of other researchers to independently evaluate the findings. In 2024, the Journal of Forensic Sciences issued an expression of concern regarding the published study, drawing attention to unresolved issues surrounding the evidence and the availability of information needed to assess or reproduce the results. In science, that matters enormously. A remarkable claim cannot rest solely on the reputation of the researcher or the excitement surrounding the discovery. Other scientists must be able to examine the methods, analyze the data, and attempt to reproduce the result. Without that independent verification, even an apparently extraordinary DNA match remains open to interpretation. Edwards, however, did not retreat from his conclusion. He continued to argue that the shawl had been preserved under conditions that could protect the biological material, and that modern analytical techniques had made it possible to recover evidence that investigators in 1888 could never have detected. From his perspective, the DNA findings did not exist in isolation. They were part of a larger historical pattern that included Kosminski's presence in Whitechapel, his appearance in police records, his deteriorating mental condition, and his proximity to the murder locations. Taken together, Edwards argued, the evidence was not merely intriguing, it was conclusive, but that is precisely where the debate became divided. Supporters saw the DNA as the missing piece of a historical puzzle. Skeptics saw a chain of assumptions built around an artifact whose provenance remained uncertain. One side argued that the probability of several independent clues pointing toward the same suspect was too striking to ignore. The other warned that once investigators become convinced that a particular person is the killer, ambiguous evidence can easily be interpreted in a way that reinforces the existing theory. This is known as confirmation bias, and it is particularly dangerous in a case as emotionally powerful as Jack the Ripper, where the desire for a definitive answer has existed for generations. The scientific controversy also changed the meaning of the shawl itself. It was no longer simply a piece of Victorian fabric. It had become a battleground between historical memory and modern forensic science, between the desire for closure and the requirement for proof. If the shawl truly came from the Eddowes crime scene, then it could represent one of the most extraordinary surviving pieces of evidence from a 19th-century murder investigation. But if its provenance was mistaken, or if the DNA was introduced through later contamination, then the same artifact could become an example of how easily an object can acquire a meaning that its original history never supported. And that left the world in an uncomfortable position by 2025. The case had never looked more solved, yet it had never been more controversial. For some, Aaron Kosminski had finally emerged from the shadows as the most convincing suspect in the entire Ripper investigation. For others, the evidence remained too fragile to justify declaring a century-old mystery closed. The shawl had brought the investigation closer to the modern world, but instead of ending the debate, it had transformed it into a question about what science can actually prove. Because if Kosminski was the killer, the shawl could be the closest thing history has ever found to a physical link between him and a Ripper victim. But if the evidence is flawed, then the most dramatic breakthrough in the case could also become one of its greatest false leads. And that is where the mystery becomes even more disturbing. The question is no longer simply, who was Jack the Ripper? It is now, how much evidence would it take before we can honestly say that we know? In 2025, the Jack the Ripper case burst out of history books and back into the headlines, with Aaron Kosminski now publicly named by some as the likely slayer. What was once a cold, unsolved mystery suddenly became a renewed call for justice. But this time, it wasn't just about theories or DNA. It was about people, real families, real grief, and, for some, the hope of closure after 137 years. The story had survived for generations, passed down through books, documentaries, and whispered conversations, but now it was being discussed in an entirely different way. The focus was shifting away from the legend of the killer and toward the women whose lives had been destroyed, and the families who had carried the memory of those murders for more than a century. Leading the charge were descendants of Catherine Eddowes, the Ripper's fourth canonical victim. When the DNA evidence allegedly connected Kosminski to the shawl, said to have been found near Eddowes' crime scene, her descendants stepped forward and called for formal recognition. They were not seeking punishment. Kosminski had been dead for more than a century. Instead, they wanted acknowledgement, a historical statement that the evidence, if accepted, had finally identified the person responsible for one of the most infamous murders in British history. "We don't want revenge," one family member reportedly said in a widely shared interview. "We just want the truth to be said out loud." The sentiment resonated because it transformed an abstract forensic debate into something deeply human. The desire of descendants to know that the suffering of their ancestors had not been forgotten. The appeal quickly spread through media outlets and social platforms, turning the alleged DNA discovery into a story about generational grief and long-awaited closure. Russell Edwards, the historian and owner of the infamous shawl, used the growing attention to promote his theory. Through book appearances, podcasts, interviews, and international television programs, Edwards presented the DNA evidence as more than a scientific breakthrough. To him, it represented a form of moral justice, an opportunity to give names and recognition to victims who had spent more than a century overshadowed by the legend of their killer. Online communities erupted with competing reactions. Supporters celebrated what they believed was the end of the mystery, while skeptics warned that emotional closure was being built on evidence that remained scientifically disputed. The debate quickly became less about whether the story was compelling and more about whether compelling evidence was the same thing as conclusive evidence. Mainstream media seized on the renewed controversy. Headlines announced the possibility that Jack the Ripper had finally been identified, while television programs and documentary producers revisited the case from new angles. In Whitechapel itself, the legacy of the murders remained visible through walking tours, historical sites, and businesses built around the Ripper legend. Some guides began incorporating the Kosminski theory into their narratives, presenting him as the most likely suspect. Others remained cautious, unwilling to declare the case solved, while historians and geneticists continued to challenge the DNA interpretation. The streets that had once been the scene of fear had become a strange mixture of history, tourism, and unresolved memory. Even descendants connected to the broader story found themselves caught in the controversy. Some appeared in interviews, expressing confusion, discomfort, or quiet acceptance. For them, the possibility that an ancestor could have been connected to such horrific crimes created an entirely different kind of burden. One sentiment often associated with descendants was simple. If the evidence is true, history must be accepted, but nothing can change what happened more than a century ago. Others chose not to comment, unwilling to carry the weight of an alleged ancestor's actions or become part of a media spectacle surrounding a crime they had never witnessed. Legally, however, the situation was far more complicated. There was no living suspect to prosecute, no conventional criminal trial to conduct, and no modern crime scene that could simply be reopened and processed under contemporary standards. What supporters were asking for was therefore largely symbolic. They wanted a formal acknowledgement, a historical correction, and perhaps some form of recognition that would give the victims and their descendants a sense of closure. But critics warned that such recognition should not be granted simply because one theory had become popular. If the underlying DNA evidence was flawed, officially naming Kosminski could transform an uncertain historical hypothesis into an accepted fact. That created a profound dilemma. Advocates argued that refusing to acknowledge the strongest available theory would leave the victims trapped forever in ambiguity. Critics countered that uncertainty was preferable to a false conclusion. Naming the wrong person, they warned, would not bring genuine justice. It would simply replace one mystery with another historical injustice. And this was the central tension surrounding the 2025 debate. Was the world finally witnessing the resolution of a 137-year-old mystery? Or was it watching the birth of a new historical controversy? By the middle of 2025, public interest had surged again, with calls for official recognition of Kosminski as the most probable perpetrator gaining attention. Whether such efforts would result in any formal action remained uncertain, but the debate itself showed no sign of disappearing. The more people examined the evidence, the more complicated the story became. Because even if Kosminski was the strongest candidate, one question remained impossible to ignore. Was he truly the man behind the myth, or had history simply found another shadow to place inside the darkness? Other suspects, forgotten shadows. Even as Aaron Kosminski reclaimed the headlines, one fact remained impossible to escape. He was never the only suspect. Far from it. Since 1888, the Jack the Ripper case has attracted an extraordinary collection of potential culprits, ranging from ordinary men with suspicious circumstances to criminals, doctors, artists, aristocrats, and figures at the center of elaborate conspiracy theories. The mystery survived not because investigators found no suspects, but because they found too many. Every generation seemed to produce another name, another theory, another piece of circumstantial evidence that appeared to explain what had happened in the dark streets of Whitechapel. One of the earliest major suspects was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher whose death in the River Thames occurred only weeks after the final canonical murder. The timing immediately attracted attention. Years later, Sir Melville Macnaghten mentioned Druitt in a confidential memorandum and suggested that his family had suspected him of being responsible for the murders. But suspicion was never converted into proof. There was no confession, no forensic evidence, and no physical connection between Druitt and the crime scenes. His story became compelling largely because of the timing of his death and the rumors surrounding his mental state, leaving him as another troubled figure trapped in the mythology of the case